A new report suggests that there's a growing number of chartered accountants who are women being appointed to decision-making positions on boards and companies listed on the JSE. It's my Monday sneeze. It's only on Mondays. Sorry. You'll know how for so many years most of these companies have been dominated by men. Even on boards with some women, some of the most powerful positions are still often held by men. Jo-ann Pöhl is a senior advisor at Kearney. Jo-ann, good afternoon to you. Thanks for your time. Apologies for the sneeze. How much progress are we seeing here? How is this picture changing?
Thank you, Stephen, and bless you to you and your sneeze this morning. I think the research, just to be clear, as the last 5 years, that the focus has been on the trends going forward. There has been some progress. Arguably, we've stagnated a little bit, but the progress that you mentioned earlier in terms of the CAs being part of the C-suite, specifically CEOs, what we have seen is quite a shift in terms of the number of CFOs, the number of women represented on audit committees as well as on risk committees, up to 40%, and as a consequence, potentially that augurs well, given the CA thinking around what that means for the route to the CEO. However, you need to be a fit-for-purpose CEO, so that CA dynamic doesn't necessarily tick the box. Outside of that, the pipeline, I think, is almost more important. So what we have seen is a lack of math literacy, a limited number of students actually going through the ranks in that math space. From a financial perspective, the pipeline is quite constrained in terms of coming out of the schooling system into the recruitment system, plus that's impacted by immigration. So it's one option, but it is not the only option to the C-suite in terms of women holding leadership positions.
I mean, it can sometimes be quite hard to work out how power works, so people can be appointed to a position but not really have the power to change things. Here, you're suggesting the way to do that is to look at the positions that, well, as always, control the money, right?
Always the case. The purse strings, I think, are important, but outside of that, it's who influences the actual decision-making. So what's interesting is we've seen with the FCA in the UK that they took the top 4 roles, the chair, the senior independent lead, as well as the CEO and FD, and are monitoring women in those specific positions where they actually have a say that is impactful in terms of where the business goes. But there are 4 things, Stephen, I think we must consider. They came out of the qualitative research, which talks to things around the glass slipper, the glass ceiling, the glass cliff, and then the glass corridor. And that being said is that it's the lift up to get there, then breaking through the barriers is one thing, but then putting more women into leadership roles at a C-suite level where a business is going through a tough time, or arguably a crisis, and the risk that they are set up to fail. And that's where the glass corridor comes into play, where we've seen women be put into leadership roles or on board positions and given the same opportunity as men, run next to them. But there's this glass divide, we were talking about it this morning with Dr. Candace Watson, of what that glass divide means in terms of an environment, policy, procedure, actually enabling women to be successful. So although you may start with the same intention, we haven't seen it play out as successfully as it should. And the numbers are encouraging, but they're definitely not there yet. Only 7% of CEOs are women.
We can see sometimes that progress can be made when we try and get more diversity, whether it's business or rugby teams. And sometimes you may think that actually you're in a sort of, a new dawn. You can get a bit disappointed, things go backwards, and then sometimes things go forward again. That probably did happen with the rugby team, to be frank. Do you think this is progress, the progress that we're seeing now? Is this progress that we will cling on to, or are you worried things could slide the other direction a bit?
So I think one thing the Springboks have taught us is stronger together is important, but the pendulum swings both ways. So we've seen an improvement in some of the roles from a board perspective in terms of parity and near parity, being 70 participants, but then we've seen no women representatives on boards or one and done at 69. So we've got this pendulum, as I said, is almost swung in both directions. So we've moved forward, but it's been gradual. And when change is gradual, often it's actually not noticed. So to be frank, there's a lot more to do. The pandemic saw us slip by 3%, so we went backwards, and we're still catching up to that. But we prefer that the report errs on the side of the optimistic. So what can be done as opposed to the fact that the numbers are fairly static, to be frank, and it's about what do we do with 7% of CEOs, the opportunity of the nominations committees, for example, those that are making decisions about who will be appointed to boards being impacted, and lead chairs in the spaces. So I don't think we're there yet. I think, if anything, we're fairly static, and it's about what we do from here. And that's why the report has shifted from 5 years of research to actually functions where we bring people together, C-suite, stakeholders, business leaders, and board members, to think what it is we need to do differently to shift the dial going forwund. Because my intention needs to play out into action. The numbers haven't yielded the results. If you think about the requirements for JSE-listed entities, targets are not doing what they need to do. They solve for unconscious bias. However, how it plays out on the ground in organizations, how we are deliberate about succession planning on boards or leadership roles, and maybe report more transparently on the 2 levels of leadership, down from the board, will help us get there.
Are there other things? I mean, if we need to move away from targets, do we need a bit more stick and a little less carrot? And all of these conversations that I've seen, often it comes down to the career path of women and, in the end, unfortunately, so often the gendered nature of childcare.
Yeah. So I think, to answer your question about stick, we've got a number of pieces of legislation, whether it's the Constitution, the broad-based black economic empowerment, the employment equity piece, the guidelines around the King codes, or even the JSE listing requirements. But none of them say specifically there's a target for women on boards. And so as a consequence, organizations have set those targets. And we've seen 44 companies achieve them, etc. But there's only so much you can say about targets and next steps. So we thought about a few things. One, do we say that your big 4 roles have to be women and monitor those, which is what the FSCA is doing in the UK? Again, your FD, CEO, your senior board, independent board member, and your chair. Or do we say that actually you're going to disclose separately who's in what role and what they're doing? Or do we bring in an organization that has its own CEO that monitors the consequences of not achieving what was intended in terms of the 30% club, for example, Southern Africa, or what boards have put in their targets? But we think we've actually got enough forums. We've got enough of these bodies. It's about how we collectively drive them to make sure people are adhering to the targets. In the UK, the voluntary board requirements saw 25% of women on boards ahead of target, 40% ahead of target. But in Norway now, not too recently, they've got a 5-year commitment that by 2028 they'll have 40% of women on boards in leadership roles in companies that are, so that's any large and medium-sized entity. So yes, I think legislation may be key in terms of helping shift the dial, but how we actually behave and how we train, and I think from an employment and recruitment perspective, how we are deliberate about who we source for various roles is key. As for women and their life choices, for me it is about life choice. I have 4 children. I think what's been interesting for me is who spoke to me when I wasn't in the room, in the sense that she's just been married, too soon to go. She just had a baby, too soon to travel. Not sure the pressure is fair. And I think often those conversations may come from a good place, but as women we should lean in. We spend more time with our family than children than women did in the 1960s, and we must embrace that. We should put our hands up. We should make sure we take someone with us on that journey. So if you are the first in the room, who is it you are opening up doors for after you? If you're looking for a successor in your role, who do you find? And if women are not successful and they require coaching in senior roles, which we've seen with that glass cliff piece, to not replace them with a man necessarily, but to understand what went wrong, and maybe the leader that comes next is less about gender, more about capabilities and competence. So there's a lot to be said, and it's less about work-life balance, much more about work-life choice. And what I do say to women out there, if you are fatigued by this journey, yes, rest, as we discussed today with the launch of the report, but do not quit. And progress is far better than perfection, and this report shows us that progress is happening. The JSE listing requirements have made an impact. The King codes have been conducive, but now corporates need to come to the party, and those that are doing this really well need to share how it gets done. And storytelling in South Africa is always something that shifts the dial in terms of people feeling it, seeing it, and believing it is possible.
Jo-ann Pöhl, thank you, Senior Advisor at Kearney. Really do appreciate the time.